There was a time when a stationary bike was worth more than Ford and Hyatt combined. Not a factory, not a fleet of cars or a chain of hotels. A bike in your living room with a screen bolted to the front and a smiling instructor telling you to pedal like your life depended on it. In early 2021, Peloton's market value brushed $50 billion. That number put a home workout company in the same conversation as century-old industrial giants, as if a subscription spin class had the power of Detroit and global hospitality rolled into one. Waitlists stretched for months. Delivery trucks could not keep up. Celebrity instructors turned into minor royalty, filling Instagram feeds and magazine covers while members talked about their favorite coach the way earlier generations talked about rock stars. It was not just exercise. It was a community that looked a lot like a congregation. People woke up at 5 a.m. to ride with the same instructor, at the same time, with the same leaderboard rivalries. They decorated spare bedrooms like shrines, hung medals on the handlebars, and logged every ride as if tracking a spiritual journey rather than a workout. Let me take you back to that moment when a $2,500 bike and a $44 monthly subscription felt less like a purchase and more like joining a movement. But markets do not worship for long. As gyms reopened and the world finally stepped back outside, the miracle valuation began to evaporate. Peloton lost more than 90% of its market value. Warehouses that once seemed too small were suddenly packed with unsold bikes and treadmills. The company canceled its own massive factory project, wrote down inventory, and watched a rotating cast of leaders try to stabilize a machine built for endless growth. Because of aggressive expansion, safety shortcuts and overconfidence collided with reality. A child's death and dozens of injuries forced recalls of treadmills that had once symbolized the future of fitness. The same brand that promised health and control was now associated with warning labels, regulatory questions, and a very public admission that its empire had grown too fast. It is an example of what happens when a good idea is treated as if the laws of business and gravity no longer apply. Peloton's story is not just about a bike. It is about how Wall Street, media, and millions of consumers can transform a solid business into a myth, then punish it when that myth breaks. His story is one of belief, money, and power moving in the same direction, at times inspiring and at times chilling, as families found real motivation while investors chased impossible perfection. In this video, the journey will run from scrappy outsider to pandemic rocket ship to sobering hangover. The question is simple: was Peloton ever built to be a $50 billion empire, or was it only priced for a world that never really existed? Peloton became the perfect symbol for that imagined world. Not only was it the bike in the living room, it was the promise on the screen. Connection when people were lonely. Discipline when days blurred together. Status when every trip outside carried risk. There was a time when owning that $2,000 bike with a $39 monthly subscription meant more than having exercise equipment. It meant proving to yourself and to everyone on that leaderboard that life hadn't completely slipped out of control. Investors saw the same glow, but through a different lens. To them, Peloton wasn't just selling hardware, it was minting recurring money. Millions of locked-in subscribers, software margins wrapped around a physical product, a brand that looked untouchable while gyms sat dark. In early 2021, the market crowned it the future of fitness, pushing the company's value near $50 billion. More than old guard names that actually owned hotels, factories, or fleets of cars. It was a triumph of story over history. Because underneath the gloss, two very different narratives were forming. On one side, this was a visionary attempt to merge hardware, software, and community into a new category, to turn a lonely bike into a global empire of instructors, metrics, and shared suffering at 6 a.m. On the other, it was a textbook case of mistaking a once-in-a-century behavioral spike for a permanent rewiring of human nature. People weren't just buying bikes, they were buying a temporary escape from fear. That tension is what makes Peloton at times inspiring and at times chilling. The inspiring part is obvious, a company convincing millions of people to work out more, to cheer each other on, to pull distant family members into the same virtual class. The chilling part is quieter, a valuation that assumed those habits would never fade, that cheap money would never end, that the world would never again choose a crowded gym over a pristine spare bedroom. It's an example of what happens when belief in a product fuses with belief in an era. The larger question reaches far beyond one company's stock chart. What happens when ambition, belief, and nearly free capital collide with a global crisis that seems to rewrite all the rules? And then that crisis ends, when demand brought forward by fear suddenly has somewhere else to go? Peloton is not just about bikes and treadmills. It's about hype cycles, the psychology of the at-home fitness, and the brutal math of subscription economics when growth slows by a single percentage point. So let me take you back to the early 2010s, before the lockdowns, before the $50 billion peak, when paying thousands of dollars for a bike with a screen sounded ridiculous to almost everyone. There was a time when this was not a pandemic rocket ship, but a strange idea from one founder and a small circle of believers trying to sell discipline and community from the corner of a tiny New York showroom. That is where the real story begins. There was a time when Peloton wasn't a ticker symbol or a pandemic religion, but a guy in his early 40s pacing around a cramped New York apartment, furious that he couldn't get into his favorite spin class. John Foley was not the usual tech messiah. No hoodie in a Palo Alto garage, no 22-year-old genius dropping out of Stanford. He was a mid-career operator who had already done the respectable tour. Barnes & Noble, Evite, real jobs, real bosses, real meetings. He had a family, a mortgage, and a growing obsession with boutique fitness. The problem in his life was simple and relentless. The classes he loved were always booked, always across town, always at the wrong time. Let me take you back to the early 2010s, when boutique fitness was turning exercise into theater. SoulCycle candles and dark rooms, Barry's boot camp red lights and military shouting. High-intensity intervals delivered by instructors who were half personal trainer, half cult leader. People weren't just buying a bike or a treadmill, they were buying proximity to that instructor, that front row, that community that knew their name. Foley watched this and realized something that would define his empire. The real product wasn't the medal, it was the human on the podium and the crowd sweating in sync. To him, the idea felt obvious. Put the instructor and the community on a screen, send it into the home, charge for access. To investors, it sounded insane. A $2,000 plus stationary bike in a world where a gym membership costs less than a monthly phone bill. On top of that, a subscription. On top of that, hardware margins, delivery crews, assembly in tiny apartments, returns, repairs, and angry customers if anything broke. Because of that cocktail of risk and logistics, many early meetings ended the same way. Polite smiles, quiet laughter, no money. His story is one of stubbornness wearing a suit and tie. Foley pitched for years, scraping together small checks, bootstrapping salaries, running a crowdfunding campaign just to prove that anyone would pay real money for a bike that didn't move. The first prototypes looked clunky, almost homemade, exposed bolts, awkward screens, a far cry from the sleek object that would later decorate Instagram feeds. Friends told him it was too expensive. Industry veterans said the market was too niche. Analysts hinted that with SoulCycle already ascendant, he was too late. Yet he kept pushing, convinced he could bend behavior if the experience was strong enough. It was, at times inspiring and at times chilling, how completely he believed that people would reorganize their lives around this machine. That same belief led him to overhire, overbuild, and overpromise long before Wall Street ever cared. It's an example of what happens when unshakable optimism becomes both the engine and the blindfold of a company. For a while, that engine would work spectacularly. But the moment when the world finally rushed to meet Foley's vision would also plant the seeds of Peloton's fall, and that moment was about to arrive much faster than anyone expected. For a while, that engine would work spectacularly. But before Peloton became a $51 billion rocket ship, there was a time when it was just a strange bike on the internet, begging strangers for money. Let me take you back to 2013. The pitch was almost disarmingly simple. Studio quality cycling classes, live and on demand, streamed straight into your home on a purpose-built bike. No commute, no crowded room, just you, a screen, and an instructor who somehow knew your name. The Kickstarter video showed glossy renderings, enthusiastic founders, and a vision that sounded closer to a boutique TV network than a piece of gym equipment. A few thousand early adopters looked at this expensive, unproven device and said, "Yes, that belongs in my living room." Those early believers weren't just buying hardware. They were buying an idea about their own life. Because from day one, Peloton chose the hard path, vertical integration. The company didn't just slap an app on a cheap bike. It designed proprietary hardware, custom tablets, and a closed ecosystem where the screen, the sensors, and the software were welded together. To ride the bike, you rode inside Peloton's world. To get the most out of it, you paid a recurring subscription month after month, feeding a business model that promised software-like wealth on top of metal and bolts. That closed loop gave Peloton power, control over the experience, control over the data, control over the money. And with that control, the brand building began. There was a time when the real product wasn't the bike at all. It was the New York studio beaming through it. Sleek sets, dramatic lighting, music cleared like a TV show. Instructors weren't nameless trainers. They were characters with distinct personas. The drill sergeant, the best friend, the spiritual guide. Leaderboards turned solitary workouts into a ruthless social game, pushing riders to chase personal records and usernames they had never met. Slowly, the company stopped selling exercise and started selling identity. Commercials showed bright apartments, attractive families, the quiet implication that owning this bike meant joining a different class of people. Hashtags appeared on the screen during rides, then migrated to Facebook groups where riders formed tribes around instructors, milestones, even inside jokes. Accountability circles emerged, with strangers checking on each other at 6 a.m., turning a gadget into a ritual, a daily anchor in the chaos of modern life. His story is one of community as distribution channel, at times inspiring and at times chilling, because it's an example of what happens when a company doesn't just enter your home, it enters your habits, your friendships, your sense of self. Yet even as the cult formed, a quieter question lingered on Wall Street and in old-school gyms. Was Peloton truly a scalable software empire, or just a very nice bike company with a good spin class and a dangerously ambitious valuation? The answer would only become clear when the world suddenly changed. There was a time when Peloton's story sounded almost too elegant to fail. On the surface, it was just a bike with a screen. Underneath, it was sold as something far more powerful, a machine that could turn one-time hardware buyers into lifelong software subscribers and predictable rivers of money. Let me take you back to the core of that promise. Peloton had two main ways of making cash. First, the hardware. Expensive connected bikes, and later treadmills. These were premium objects, 2,000 plus machines rolled into living rooms, like luxury cars for the home. Yet the margins on that hardware were surprisingly thin, squeezed by manufacturing, shipping, and constant upgrades. The real treasure sat on top of the bike, not inside it, the subscription. For a monthly fee, each household unlocked Peloton's content platform, a 24/7 channel of live and on-demand classes, leaderboards, and coaching. Those digital subscriptions carried far higher gross margins than the bikes themselves. Once the content was produced and the servers were running, every additional subscriber looked almost pure profit. It's an example of what happens when a fitness company learns the language of Silicon Valley and discovers that Wall Street loves recurring revenue more than steel and bolts. So Peloton did not pitch itself as a mere fitness equipment manufacturer. To investors, it was a SaaS-like empire in the making, a software platform that just happened to arrive on a very shiny bike. The story was one of predictable growing cash flows and near religious customer loyalty. Management highlighted connected fitness subscribers, not just units shipped. They talked about average monthly workouts per user as proof that people weren't abandoning the bike after New Year's. They were riding 3, 5, 10 times a week. Churn rates became another weapon in the narrative. Month after month, Peloton pointed to low cancellations, arguing that once someone joined, they rarely left. The message was clear. This was not a fad. This was a habit. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the data painted a picture of a company that didn't just sell exercise, it rewired daily life. But hidden inside that elegant chart deck was a hard, unromantic tension. To grow those beautiful subscription numbers, Peloton still needed a constant stream of new hardware sales. No bike in the home meant no new subscriber on the platform. The dream was an eventual flywheel, where the installed base became so large and the brand so powerful that hardware faded into the background and the software money rolled in almost on autopilot. That dream came with a dangerous catch. When a company is valued like a pure software platform, but still lives and dies by selling large, discretionary machines, any shock to demand doesn't just slow growth, it tears the story open. The moment the world stepped back into gyms, that tension would stop being theoretical and start showing up in the numbers. That tension was already baked into Peloton's DNA by the time it walked onto Wall Street's stage. In late 2019, as bankers polished pitch decks and founders rehearsed their lines, Peloton's IPO roadshow tried to tell a very specific story. Not just a bike, not just a treadmill, a new way of life. The future of fitness, streamed into your living room, paid for on a subscription, and wrapped in the language of community, motivation, even identity. There was a time when a company selling stationary bikes would have been filed under retail. Peloton insisted it belonged next to Netflix. The pitch leaned hard on software-style metrics, engagement minutes, monthly workouts per subscriber, churn that looked low for a consumer brand, charts of recurring revenue climbing up and to the right. But behind those glossy slides sat stubborn facts, heavy hardware, manufacturing risk, and ongoing losses. Because of that hardware exposure and the money it burned every quarter, plenty of investors stared at the numbers and quietly backed away. They had seen connected gadgets boom and bust before, and they wondered whether this empire of steel frames and touchscreens could really be valued like code. Then, right before the big debut, Peloton became famous for a reason it never wanted. The Peloton wife ad hit the internet. A nervous-looking woman documenting a year with her new bike, gifted by her wealthy, perfectly groomed husband. Overnight, the brand turned into a cultural punchline. Commentators mocked the privilege, the body image implications, the strange, anxious tone. Late-night hosts piled on. It's an example of what happens when a company tries to sell aspiration and accidentally reveals how narrow its vision of aspirational really is. Yet under the noise, the core machine was still working. Subscribers were growing fast. Workouts per user kept climbing. The community, with its high-fiving leaderboards and instructor fan clubs, felt at times inspiring and at times chilling, like a cheerful cult built around cardio and personal bests. To believers, that intensity proved this was more than a fad. Yes, profitability was distant, but the bet was simple. Keep the family in the living room, keep them paying, and the wealth would follow. The stock's early life reflected that split personality. Trading opened below the IPO price, then swung wildly. Short sellers circled, arguing Peloton was just an overhyped gadget destined for the closet next to the abandoned ab roller. Bulls fired back, calling it the Netflix of fitness, a platform that would compound for years as content scaled and hardware faded into the background. Volatility became part of the story, a public referendum on whether Peloton represented the future or a very expensive phase. By the start of 2020, Peloton was a controversial but promising growth story. Not a safe blue chip, not yet a market darling, but a company priced for steady, disciplined expansion. What no one on that roadshow had modeled, what no spreadsheet had dared to imagine, was what would happen when the entire world was suddenly locked inside the very living rooms Peloton wanted to conquer. That was when the bike stopped being a question mark and, for a brief, dizzying moment, became something closer to destiny. There was a time when a $2,500 bike in your living room looked like a midlife crisis. In March 2020, it started to look like survival gear. Over a few terrifying weeks, the world slammed shut. Gyms, spin studios, yoga lofts, all the temples of modern fitness went dark. People were locked in small apartments with too much anxiety, too much time, and a creeping fear that life, as they knew it, might not come back. In that silence, the glowing Peloton screen suddenly felt less like a luxury and more like a lifeline. The company that had been fighting to justify its price tag now found the world rearranged to fit its pitch. Let me take you back to those early lockdown days. Demand didn't just rise, it detonated. Wait times for a bike stretched from a couple of weeks to 3, then 4, then 10. Customer service lines jammed. Delivery trucks were booked out. Warehouses overflowed and were still not enough. Peloton scrambled to add factories, to charter planes when ports were clogged, to rewire its entire logistics network, while the rest of the economy was hitting the brakes. The empire of boutique hardware that once looked fragile suddenly could not build product fast enough. For millions of new riders, this wasn't just about burning calories, it was about not losing their minds. Live classes became daily rituals, a strange glowing replacement for the office, the bar, the gym. Instructors looked straight through the camera and talked about case counts, fear, loneliness, the small victories of getting through another day. People high-fived usernames they would never meet, cried on their handlebars, and clung to the rhythm of a 45-minute ride as if it were a rope thrown into deep water. In a moment of global isolation, Peloton was selling something rarer than cardio, the illusion of a crowd. Money followed that emotion. Revenue more than doubled year over year. Connected fitness subscribers surged into the millions. Usage spiked, churn fell, and the stock chart began to look less like a business and more like a rocket launch. Not only was Peloton suddenly worth tens of billions, at one point it was valued higher than old industrial icons that actually made cars and hotels. Wall Street, seeing the numbers, quietly rewrote its story from niche gadget maker to inevitable platform for the future of exercise. And that, at times inspiring and at times chilling, is where the illusion took hold. Because people were riding more, canceling less, and swearing they would never go back to sweaty, crowded gyms, many assumed this was the new default, not a crisis-driven exception. It's an example of what happens when a moment in life is mistaken for a permanent shift in human nature. For a while, it felt like the outside world might never matter again. But doors do not stay locked forever. There was a time when, as those doors creaked open, Peloton's value rocketed past companies that had spent a century mastering the physical world. By early 2021, the market was whispering a staggering number, $50 billion. Not only was this a home fitness brand trading like a global empire, for a brief moment it was worth more than Ford, and in the same conversation as major hotel chains combined, even though those hotels controlled real buildings and Ford sold millions of cars while Peloton sold bikes and subscriptions. To understand that leap, let me take you back to the story investors were telling themselves. Peloton was no longer just selling hardware. It was the operating system for movement at home. The bike was the gateway, the subscription was the engine, and the instructors were the religion. From that base, the narrative said, Peloton could move into strength, rowing, boxing, apparel, even corporate wellness programs streaming into office gyms. One bike in the bedroom today, a whole ecosystem of branded health and performance tomorrow. Because the numbers in that narrow window of time seemed to back it up. Revenue more than doubled. Waitlists stretched for months. Millions of connected fitness subscribers were paying every month, rarely canceling, telling friends and family to join the cult. If a company can acquire a customer once, keep them for years, and then sell them more and more products, Wall Street will pay dearly for that promise. In 2021, it paid almost as if success was guaranteed. Peloton was not alone. Zoom was suddenly worth more than the world's largest airlines. Netflix added years of subscriber growth in a few quarters. Any business that lived through a screen was treated as if it had discovered a permanent cheat code to human behavior. The belief was simple and at times inspiring and at times chilling. COVID had pulled the future forward. What might have taken a decade of digital adoption had been compressed into a single traumatic year. Cheap money poured gasoline on that belief. With interest rates pinned near zero, holding cash felt foolish. Investors hunted for yield, for growth, for any story that promised to turn lockdown misery into future wealth. That search led them to pay extreme multiples for stay-at-home winners, to ignore valuation history, to call a company with a few billion in revenue and heavy losses the next great consumer technology empire. It's an example of what happens when money is almost free and imagination is very expensive. Yet underneath the euphoria, a quiet question was forming. Were these numbers a new normal or a one-time sugar high from a world where going to the gym was literally illegal in many places? When the doors stayed locked, Peloton looked inevitable. The real test would come when those doors finally swung open and people had to choose. That choice was about to hit harder than anyone on Wall Street wanted to admit. Because when those doors reopened, Peloton wasn't just competing with gyms. It was competing with something far more dangerous, the return of ordinary life. To understand why that was such a threat, you have to see what Peloton had turned itself into inside those lockdown homes. There was a time when Peloton instructors were not just trainers on a screen, they were minor deities in spandex. Cody Rigsby with his pop culture monologues and boo catchphrases, Robin Arzon preaching hustle and no ego amigo, Alex Toussaint barking about discipline, and another one. Like a DJ of suffering, millions of rides later, riders knew their playlists, their pets, their family dramas. They celebrated engagements, pregnancies, even injuries, as if they were watching a close friend's life unfold in real time. This was the strange power of parasocial relationships. A rider in Ohio could ride with the same instructor 5 days a week, hear the same voice push them through the same dark mornings, and feel genuinely seen, even if the instructor never learned their name. Because of this emotional repetition and carefully curated intimacy, Peloton turned a rotating cast of fitness professionals into an empire of household names, each with their own loyal faction, their own internal fan clubs, their own brand of devotion. But charisma alone doesn't keep people clipping in at 6 a.m. The leaderboard did something even more radical. It took a solitary, sweaty, often boring act and made it public. Suddenly, your output number, your rank, your little username were stacked against thousands of others. Not only were you working out, you were performing, competing, chasing the rider just above you, trying not to get passed by the one just behind. Progress tracking, status, fear of falling behind peers, all compressed into a glowing column of names. Let me take you back to those milestone rides. The 50th, 100th, 500th class. Instructors calling out usernames from a scrolling sea of handles, confetti animations exploding on screen, hashtags like Garn Peloton Moms or Baisu Black Girl Magic, or working from home binding strangers into micro-tribes. The bake was hardware, the rituals were liturgy. For many, Peloton stopped being a product and became a lifestyle, a core piece of identity that sat somewhere between hobby and religion. Real stories cemented that faith. People credited Peloton with triple-digit weight loss, with pulling them out of depression, with keeping them sane after a death in the family. During the pandemic, some said those rides quite literally saved their lives, keeping their hearts strong and their minds from breaking. When a company is woven into your health, your routine, your sense of self, it doesn't feel like a subscription. It feels like a relationship, at times inspiring and at times chilling. But here's the risk. When a company becomes a church, the real crisis isn't when growth slows on a spreadsheet. It's when believers quietly start skipping services. One missed ride, then a week, then a month. A new gym opens down the street, a cheaper app appears on the phone, a friend drags them back to in-person classes. And if Peloton had built a faith, the next phase of the story would show what happens when that faith is tested. Tested by something no leaderboard could outrank. Tested by something no leaderboard could outrank. There was a time when Peloton's problem wasn't demand, it was physics. Too many orders, not enough bikes, not enough treadmills, and a global supply chain melting down in real time. The faith was strong, the congregation was growing, and the empire suddenly needed far more steel, screens, and shipping containers than it had ever imagined. So the company did what hypergrowth companies do. It stepped on the gas. Peloton signed new manufacturing partners in Asia, pushed existing factories to run hotter, and then made a dramatic move. It agreed to buy Precor, a legacy name in commercial gym equipment, for around $420 million. Overnight, Peloton gained US factories, engineers who knew how to build at scale, and a way into hotels and corporate fitness rooms. On paper, it looked like a shortcut from scrappy upstart to industrial power. But that was only the beginning. In 2021, Peloton announced Peloton Output Park, a massive factory complex in Ohio. A 1 million square foot monument to the idea that pandemic demand wasn't a spike. It was the new normal. Let me take you back to that moment on Wall Street. Revenue was surging, subscribers were piling in, and executives spoke about securing long-term capacity as if they were locking in a new law of nature. Hardware, software, content, community. His story is one of turning a bike into a lifestyle, and then turning that lifestyle into concrete, steel, and fixed costs. Outside those plans, the world was less cooperative. Global shipping costs exploded, ports clogged, and container ships sat idle for weeks. Bikes that once floated across the Pacific cheaply were now fighting for space at any price. To protect its brand promise of premium service and relatively quick delivery, Peloton resorted at times to flying products by air. Imagine the economics of that. A heavy, low-margin piece of hardware riding on one of the most expensive forms of freight, just to keep wait times from becoming a public embarrassment. Inside the company, the strain was just as intense. Customer service lines backed up. Delivery windows slipped from weeks to months. The carefully choreographed white glove experience turned into something much messier, with frustrated families waiting in small apartments, staring at empty corners where a $2,500 bike was supposed to go. The more Peloton spent to fix the experience, the more it locked itself into the illusion that this level of demand would last. Underneath, a quieter force was at work. Demand pull forward. Years of potential customers, people who might have bought a bike in 2023 or 2024, all purchased in 2020 and 2021 because gyms were closed and life felt uncertain. It's an example of what happens when an abnormal world compresses a decade of growth into a few quarters. Revenue charts looked like a rocket, so Peloton hired, built factories, filled warehouses, and finally treated pandemic numbers as a baseline, not an outlier. The reversal would come when the world left the house again. Those long-term bets made in a once-in-a-century moment were about to collide with a far more ordinary reality. Those long-term bets only worked if the rocket never came back to Earth. But while Wall Street celebrated the trajectory, the first cracks were already spidering through the surface. There was a time when ordering a Peloton meant bragging to friends, then waiting and waiting. Delivery windows stretched from weeks into months. Customers cleared out living rooms, took time off work for scheduled drop-offs, only to watch the truck never arrive. Social feeds that once overflowed with sweaty high fives and leaderboard screenshots slowly filled with a different kind of post. Screenshots of support chats, angry threads about missed appointments, and long unanswered emails. The empire of convenience was starting to feel strangely inconvenient. On the inside, the pressure was even more intense. To feed that $50 billion dream, Peloton locked in aggressive manufacturing contracts, booked factory time, and tried to stand up its own production muscle in a world where supply chains were already breaking. Some teams reportedly warned that chasing every order at any cost meant cutting corners. Quality checks rushed, onboarding for new suppliers compressed, safety flags competing with volume targets. When treadmills as a category already carried risk, even small signals about hazards around children and pets should have echoed loudly. Instead, the dominant tone from the top stayed remarkably calm, almost serene. John Foley and his executives told investors this was not a blip, not a lockdown sugar high, but a permanent reset in how people would work out. Conference calls framed the surge as proof that Peloton had changed daily life, that demand was structurally higher now, that the brand had moved from niche hardware to global platform. At times inspiring and at times chilling, it was a story about destiny more than probability. Because once a company is priced for perfection, doubt itself becomes dangerous. If leaders even hinted that demand might normalize when gyms reopened, the valuation could wobble, the easy money could disappear, and the dream of category domination could slip away. So the safer move, at least in the short term, was to believe the rosiest forecast, to assume every delayed bike was just deferred revenue, not a warning sign about frustrated families and eroding goodwill. Let me take you back to those earnings calls for a moment. Revenue records broken, subscriber numbers up, charts racing up and to the right. Yet behind the scenes, complaints piled up. Regulators began asking harder questions about safety, and warehouses filled with inventory promised to investors long before it was safely in living rooms. It's an example of what happens when money, momentum, and market power all push in the same direction, forward, faster, and with less and less room to swerve. By early 2021, Peloton's stock price made it look untouchable, but the higher it climbed, the thinner the ice became. One serious stumble, a recall, a demand slowdown, a public loss of trust, would not just hurt sales, it could puncture the entire narrative that justified the wealth on paper. That misstep was closer than anyone wanted to admit. That misstep arrived on a treadmill. There was a time when Peloton's biggest risk seemed like boredom, not bodily harm. The brand had sold life, energy, community. The worst-case scenario in most people's minds was an expensive clothes hanger in the corner. Then, in 2021, the Peloton Tread Plus became the center of a story that felt less like wellness and more like a crime scene. Let me take you back to the spring of that year. Federal regulators began compiling reports. Pets pulled under the machine, adults pinned, children trapped. In one incident, described in Consumer Product Safety Commission filings, a child was drawn beneath the rear roller, crushed, and killed. The language in those documents was clinical, but the images they implied were brutal. This was not a chipped paint issue. It was a 450-pound slab of metal and power turning a family living room into a hazard zone. Because of those reports, the CPSC did something rare. It issued a public warning telling owners to stop using the Tread Plus immediately, to keep the machines away from children and pets, to move them into locked rooms. For a company that had built an empire on trust and daily habit, that message was radioactive. Yet Peloton's first move was not surrender. It pushed back, calling the warning inaccurate and misleading, insisting the machine was safe when used properly, framing the tragedy as misuse rather than design. That response landed with a thud. To regulators, it looked defensive. To many parents, it looked ruthless. Because when a brand that talks about family, wellness, and community responds to a child's death with legal nuance, the moral math changes quickly. It's an example of what happens when a growth story, at times inspiring and at times chilling, collides with the slower, messier work of accountability. Under mounting pressure, the stance cracked. In May 2021, Peloton finally agreed to recall roughly 125,000 Tread Plus units. On paper, the direct cost was in the tens of millions: refunds, repairs, halted sales. In practice, the bill was much higher. Each treadmill had to be retrieved or modified inside someone's home, which meant scheduling visits, moving massive machines through narrow hallways, and swallowing the humiliation of uninstalling what had once been a status symbol. The recall exposed more than a safety flaw. It revealed operational fragility. Reverse logistics on that scale are a nightmare, even for old-line appliance makers. For a high-growth tech darling, suddenly acting like a nationwide moving company, the strain was obvious, and reputationally, the damage was worse. Peloton had sold not just hardware, but a feeling that this screen, this instructor, this monthly subscription were safer than the chaotic gym. Now, the brand name sat next to words like entrapment, laceration, and death in national headlines. The company that once symbolized control and health now looked reactive, slow, and strangely powerless. The timing could not have been worse. Just as the recall was unfolding, vaccines were rolling out, cities were reopening, and the world was stepping back outside. Peloton would soon face its biggest test yet, convincing millions of customers to stay on a machine that had stopped feeling invincible. At the exact moment, the doors to cheaper, simpler treadmills at the local gym were swinging open again. So when those doors finally swung open, it wasn't just fluorescent lights and rows of treadmills waiting on the other side. It was competition. It was comparison. It was the real world quietly asking, Peloton's $50 billion dream, a very simple question. Do people still want to sweat alone in their spare bedroom? Let me take you back to mid-2021. Vaccination campaigns were rolling through cities, case counts were dropping, and the same governments that had once ordered everyone inside were now telling them to come back out. There was a time when the highlight of a week was a live ride with a favorite instructor. Suddenly, the highlight was brunch, travel, office gossip, even sitting in traffic again. After a year of staring at the same walls, the most attractive feature in life wasn't a leaderboard. It was leaving the house. Gyms felt that shift first. Chains that had been ghost towns flickered back to life as the regulars returned. Then the casuals. Then the people who had sworn they were home workout forever converts. Boutique studios reopened with ClassPass style variety. Boxing on Monday, hot yoga on Wednesday. Reformer Pilates on Saturday, each one offering something Peloton's empire of screens could not. Bodies in the room, an instructor's glance. The subtle pressure of not being the one to quit early. After isolation, even sharing a set of dumbbells with a stranger felt new. For Peloton, the change was quiet, but it was ruthless. Most riders didn't rush to cancel. They kept the bike, kept the subscription, kept telling friends they loved it. But the habit loop that had been forged in lockdown began to weaken. A Tuesday ride became a Tuesday gym session. A Saturday long ride became brunch, a walk, then maybe a 10-minute stretch class at home, if there was time. Usage intensity slipped, and with it, the emotional lock-in that had once made the machine feel indispensable. On Wall Street spreadsheets, that subtle behavioral drift turned into real money. Hardware orders slowed as the demand that had been pulled forward in 2020 and early 2021 finally hit a wall. Suddenly, Peloton was lapping quarters where revenue had more than doubled, and every new earnings report was compared against a once-in-a-century lockdown. Growth decelerated, inventory piled up, and investors who had priced the company like a flawless software monopoly were forced to recalibrate. This was still a strong brand, still a meaningful business, but the story of infinite, unstoppable expansion was cracking. Because under the fluorescent lights, a different truth was reappearing. People didn't hate gyms, they hated being forced into them. Peloton had given them control, convenience, and a new kind of community. But as the world reopened, another possibility emerged. Maybe this was never going to be a total replacement. Maybe it was always destined to be a powerful complement, one pillar in a hybrid fitness life, miscast for a brief, euphoric moment as the only future that mattered. And if that was true, what did it mean for a company that had already spent like the monopoly it believed it had become? There was a time when Peloton's numbers did not just look good, they looked supernatural. Revenue lines went vertical, subscriber counts exploded, and waiting months for a $2,500 bike felt normal. On paper, it looked like the birth of a new fitness empire. In reality, a quieter, more ruthless force was at work. Demand pull forward. Demand pull forward sounds technical, but the idea is simple. Imagine all the people who might have bought a Peloton over 5 or 6 years. Now imagine a global lockdown that shuts gyms, terrifies families, and hands millions of white-collar workers unexpected time and money. Those future customers do not disappear. They just all show up at once. Purchases that would have been spread across half a decade get compressed into 18 frantic months. Let me take you back to that 2020-2021 sales curve. Orders surge. Bikes are on back order. Revenue more than doubles year over year. Wall Street starts doing straight line math from the peak, as if every quarter from now on will look like the quarter where half the country is banned from leaving the house. Then gyms reopen, kids go back to school, commutes return, and suddenly the line bends. Growth slows sharply, not because the product has collapsed, but because the most eager, highest intent customers already bought during the panic. This is not unique to Peloton. Zoom went from obscure enterprise tool to verb, then watched. Usage normalized the moment conference rooms came back to life. Netflix added tens of millions of subscribers in a single year, then hit a wall, even losing subscribers as people remembered they did not need 4 streaming services at once. It is an example of what happens when investors mistake an emergency spike for a permanent change in human nature. Peloton's leadership, though, treated the spike as the new floor, not the ceiling. They signed long-term manufacturing contracts. They broke ground on Peloton Output Park, a massive US factory built as if every year would be peak COVID forever. They hired thousands, expanded content, and scaled fixed costs as if the only direction was up. The story on earnings calls was clear. This demand was not a fluke. This was the future of exercise. Then the brutal math arrived. Fixed costs built for a fantasy world do not gently adjust when reality comes back. When order volumes slip back towards something like normal, the same factories, leases, and payrolls that once made Peloton look like a high-margin machine turn those glossy profit charts into a sea of red ink almost overnight. The life of a high-growth darling flipped into that of a turnaround case. And yet, at times inspiring and at times chilling, the company still had millions of loyal riders, powerful brand recognition, and a real business buried under the wreckage of its own expectations. The question now was no longer how high this empire could climb, but how much pain it would take to resize itself to the world that finally walked back into the gym. There was a time when Peloton's problem was too many orders and not enough bikes. Now the problem was the opposite. Imagine walking into a cavernous warehouse, row after row of sleek black frames and gleaming touchscreens, stacked on racks and pallets, wrapped in plastic, waiting for riders who would never come. That was the new empire, not a buzzing community, but silent hardware gathering dust. Let me take you back to late 2021 and early 2022. Demand had already rolled over, gyms were filling up again, and yet Peloton's supply chain was still operating, as if the world was locked inside forever. Containers kept arriving, contract manufacturers kept shipping. Facilities in the US and overseas filled with bikes and treadmills built for a level of hunger that had evaporated. Every unsold unit was more than metal and code. It was money frozen in place, a balance sheet monument to overconfidence. Inventory at that scale is heavy in every sense. It ties up cash that could have funded new classes, better software, or simply survival. To clear the backlog, Peloton turned to discounting, promotions, limited time offers that would have been unthinkable when customers waited months and bragged about paying full price. The premium halo dimmed. A product that once signaled wealth and exclusivity began to look like just another piece of fitness equipment on sale, and that erosion of power around the brand hurt more than any single quarter's miss. Because of those ruthless miscalculations, Peloton had to unwind the grandest symbol of its manufacturing ambition. Peloton Output Park, a massive US factory in Ohio that had been announced with fanfare as a $400 million bet on the future. Before it even opened, the project was canceled. Contracts were renegotiated, commitments walked back, and the company took hundreds of millions in write-downs on excess inventory and overbuilt capacity. Buried in those charges was an admission Wall Street did not miss. The forecasts had not just been optimistic, they had been wildly, embarrassingly wrong. Optics mattered. Photos and reports of warehouses full of unused bikes landed side by side with old clips of members complaining about 6-month wait lists. The whiplash was brutal. It's an example of what happens when a growth story that once looked at times inspiring and at times chilling suddenly flips into a cautionary tale of mismanagement. Investors saw not just a cyclical slowdown, but a leadership team that had driven the company straight into a wall of its own making. And beneath the numbers, there was a deeper question. If Peloton couldn't sell the hardware, could it still sell the dream? That question would trigger resignations, boardroom battles, and a strategic pivot away from being a hyper-growth hardware darling toward a leaner, subscription-driven platform. The warehouses full of bikes were not the end of the story, but they were the clearest sign that the next chapter would be written by very different hands. Peloton couldn't sell the hardware. Could it still sell the dream? For years, that dream had a face: John Foley, the scrappy founder who went from being laughed out of venture meetings to commanding a $50 billion empire of bikes, screens, and sweat. There was a time when his story is one of pure startup mythology. A product-obsessed dad in a cramped apartment, hauling prototypes up walk-ups, begging landlords to let him test studios, convinced that putting instructors on a screen could change lives. He rode the early bike himself, hovered over engineers, read comment threads at night. Employees talked about him with something close to loyalty. Riders described him as the believer-in-chief, the guy who really meant it when he said Peloton wasn't about hardware, it was about community. Success amplified that image. Roadshow pitches where he promised Peloton would be the Netflix of fitness, all-access passes to a future where gyms looked old and clumsy. During lockdowns, that vision looked prophetic. Revenue more than doubled. Waitlists stretched for months, and for a brief, dizzy period, Foley seemed like the rare founder who had timed the world perfectly. But because the rise was so extreme, the turn came just as hard. As gyms reopened and demand cracked, the same traits that once felt visionary began to look ruthless, stubborn, even reckless. Let me take you back to the recall crisis. After a child's death involving a Peloton treadmill, regulators pushed for a warning. Foley pushed back, publicly insisting the product was safe if used properly. When Peloton finally recalled roughly 125,000 machines, the delay didn't just cost money, it cost trust. Analysts who once praised his conviction now framed him as overconfident and slow to admit mistakes. He had committed to building a massive US factory, locked in long-term supply contracts, and expanded headcount as if pandemic demand would last forever. When the stock began its 90% plunge, those bets looked less like boldness and more like a refusal to believe the world had changed. Because of that refusal, the boardroom stopped being a cheering section and turned into a pressure cooker. Activist investors arrived, letters leaked, and behind closed doors the message was blunt. Cut costs, cut projects, cut the dream down to something that could actually make money. It's an example of what happens when Wall Street falls out of love with a founder. The same charisma that once protected him now drew fire. In early 2022, Foley finally stepped down as CEO, sliding into the softer title of executive chairman. That compromise lasted months, not years. By the fall, he resigned from the board entirely. The founder, who had once been Peloton's entire identity, was suddenly on the outside, watching the empire he'd built from his living room be restructured without him. At times inspiring and at times chilling, his exit marked the end of the founder era and the beginning of something colder. A new CEO walked in with a mandate to save a company wired for lockdown life in a world that had moved on. The question now was simple and terrifying. Could anyone fix Peloton without breaking what made it special in the first place? So Peloton did something almost unthinkable for a company built on charisma and cult energy. It hired a spreadsheet, not a new visionary, not another hype merchant, but Barry McCarthy, the former CFO of Netflix and Spotify, a man whose life's work was turning monthly fees into an empire of predictable cash. There was a time when that would have sounded like heresy inside Peloton. This was a place where the story was about changing lives, not trimming budgets. But the board didn't want inspiration anymore. It wanted survival. McCarthy walked in with gray hair, a calm voice, and a mandate to do what founders rarely do voluntarily: say no. His story is one of quiet power. At Netflix, he watched the company pivot from mailing DVDs to streaming bits, building a subscription machine that could fund original content. At Spotify, he helped sell Wall Street on the idea that recurring revenue mattered more than short-term profits. He understood subscriptions, churn, the brutal math of content costs, and how to keep money flowing long after the initial hype died down. So when he looked at Peloton, he didn't see a religion. He saw a business bleeding cash. His first priorities were simple and ruthless: slash costs, reduce headcount by thousands, kill the dream of owning every factory and every truck. Peloton output. Park, the proud American manufacturing project, was quietly unwound before it was even finished. The message was clear. This would no longer be a monument to ambition. It would be a machine for survival. Instead of chasing hypergrowth, McCarthy focused on something far less glamorous: cash flow. Hardware would no longer be a sacred object. It would be a means to an end. He pushed for lower-priced bikes, rental programs, and refurbished options, anything that could get more people paying that monthly subscription without demanding a $2,500 leap of faith up front. Then came the strategic heresy. Peloton, once obsessed with owning the entire journey from warehouse to living room, began exploring third-party distribution. Bikes in Amazon listings, machines on showroom floors that didn't bear its logo on the lease. And behind all of it, a deeper shift. The idea that the real product wasn't the metal, it was the app. The instructors, the classes, the leaderboard, the feeling. The bike was just the doorway, but it's an example of what happens when a mission-driven culture meets a calculator. Inside the company, the mood changed. Lavish perks disappeared. Hiring froze. Teams that had been told to dream bigger were suddenly told to do more with less. Some employees left on their own. Others left with severance. Die-hard fans watched the layoffs and the Amazon deals and wondered if the brand they loved was being hollowed out into just another subscription line item. Pattern interrupt. This was the moment Peloton stopped asking, "How big can this get?" and started asking, "Can this even last?" The central question hung over every town hall and every earnings call. Could Peloton transform from a pandemic rocket ship into a steady, mid-growth subscription business without losing the magic that made it special in the first place? The next chapter would show whether a turnaround CEO could save the company's balance sheet without killing its soul. That question hit a deeper problem on Peloton's balance sheet, and it wasn't philosophical at all. Wall Street had priced this company like it was Netflix, but under the hood, it still needed you to do something very old-fashioned. Swipe a card for a $2,000 bike and find a corner of your living room to park it. There was a time when that tension didn't seem to matter. In 2020, demand was so extreme that bikes were back-ordered for months. Delivery trucks were full, and every new hardware sale conveniently produced a new high-margin subscription. The story sounded perfect. Sell a machine once, stream classes forever, let the wealth roll in. But when gyms reopened and the waitlist vanished, the math turned on them. Slowing bike and treadmill sales meant fewer fresh subscribers, and suddenly the gleaming software multiple depended on a factory in Taiwan and a customer willing to finance a piece of furniture with pedals. Peloton's empire had been sold as a content powerhouse, a media company that just happened to have hardware attached. In reality, the hardware was the gatekeeper. Without a constant flow of new bikes entering homes, the total number of connected fitness subscribers plateaued, and the whole promise of infinite scale started to look fragile. Content costs were fixed, instructors were celebrities, studios had to run, servers had to stream. When growth cooled, each new class wasn't being spread over millions of new signups. It was being amortized over a base that wasn't expanding fast enough to justify $50 billion. So the company went hunting for new doors into the ecosystem. Cheaper equipment, aggressive financing, pay nothing today, offers that quietly stretched out for years. Then came the standalone app push, a bet that people with generic bikes, or even just a yoga mat on the floor, could still be pulled into the Peloton life. Let me take you back to the ads showing riders on no-name bikes, phones clipped to handlebars, as if the hardware were now an afterthought. It was a subtle admission. The empire needed more citizens than the premium machines alone could deliver. But while Peloton tried to go down market on access, the competition was racing up behind it. Echelon and Nordic Track offered cheaper connected bikes, often bundled with their own content. At the same time, Apple Fitness Plus and a wave of low-cost apps turned any $300 Amazon bike into a connected experience. Because of this flood of rivals, Peloton's premium pitch started to sound less like inevitable progress and more like an expensive habit. His story is one of timing and leverage. Peloton's is one of structure. It found itself trapped in the middle, too hardware heavy to become a pure software play, too content dependent to relax into being just another equipment brand. It's an example of what happens when a company is valued for the business it hopes to be, while still paying the bills with the business it actually is. The next move would force Peloton to decide which life it truly wanted. Peloton's answer to that question came from a quiet number most people never saw on a billboard: churn. Not the hype of new bike deliveries, not the screaming leaderboard, but the percentage of subscribers canceling their memberships each month. Move churn a fraction of a point, and the entire empire of projected cash flows, lifetime values, and $50 billion dreams starts to wobble. There was a time when churn barely seemed to exist. Lockdowns trapped people at home, gyms were closed, and that $39 monthly fee felt like a small price for sanity, community, and a body that hadn't fully merged with the couch. Engagement was insane. Riders stacked streaks, chased badges, and talked about instructors like extended family. Wall Street took those months, drew a straight line into the future, and treated them as Peloton's new normal. Then the doors of the outside world creaked open. At first, engagement didn't collapse, it frayed. A rider who used to take 5 classes a week took 3, then 1. then decided that on sunny days an outdoor run with friends felt better than sweating alone in the guest room. Another renewed a long-forgotten gym membership, telling themselves the bike would be for busy weeks that somehow never arrived. This is how churn actually looks in real life. Not a mass exodus, but believers quietly slipping away. One skipped ride, one new routine, one credit card review at a time. The question shifted from, is Peloton worth it, to am I still using this enough to justify the money? For a business priced like a religion, that tiny moment of doubt is lethal. Peloton fought back. It launched new class formats, leaned into strength, yoga, meditation, and stretching, tried to be not just a bike company, but a full-body, full-life platform. It added gamification, new badges, power zone programs, scenic rides, and artist series, anything that might trigger one more login, one more month, one more reason not to cancel. Marketing campaigns reframed the product as a hybrid companion to gym life instead of a replacement, quietly admitting that staying home forever was no longer the default. Some of it worked. Many riders deepened their habits, found new instructors, and finally used the non-cycling content they'd ignored for years. But even the best programming could not repeal gravity. Subscription fatigue crept in, competing apps undercut the price, and daily routines rewired themselves around commutes, kids' schedules, and yes, old-fashioned gym classes. Let me take you back to the core behavior Peloton had been built on, people staying home. That behavior was never promised. It was a moment in history. And it's an example of what happens when a digital community, at times inspiring and at times chilling in its intensity, rests on a lifestyle that can vanish as soon as the world reopens the door. The next phase would show what happens when that door doesn't just open, it slams back into the company's face. That door didn't just hit Peloton on the way out. It exposed what was hiding behind it, an incredibly expensive content machine that had to keep running, even when fewer people were watching. There was a time when Peloton looked less like a bike company and more like a media empire. 2 gleaming studios in New York and London, multiple sound stages, camera crews, lighting techs, editors, producers, music licensing teams, software engineers, data scientists, and a control room that looked closer to a live sports broadcast than a spin class. All of it built to beam motivation into living rooms at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. At the center of that operation were the instructors. Not anonymous trainers, but stars with fan bases, parasocial relationships, and their own gravitational pull on the brand. They sold the story of a better life, talked about family, pain, ambition, and turned a 45-minute ride into a ritual. Some members didn't say they were using Peloton. They said they were riding with Cody or running with Robin. That loyalty was priceless. It was also very expensive, because to keep those stars, Peloton had to pay. High 6-figure and reportedly 7-figure compensation packages, bonuses, equity, agents, managers, and the unspoken cost of making sure no one felt replaceable. When a single personality can move hardware sales and keep tens of thousands of people from canceling, the power balance shifts. Suddenly, the empire depends on a handful of human beings who can burn out, leave, or simply lose relevance when trends change. Digital content scales better than hardware, but it is not free. Especially not when the promises live in on-demand classes, across cycling, running, strength, yoga, boot camps, and more every single day. Every new modality meant new sets, new coaches, new filming schedules, new engineering work to integrate metrics and leaderboards. The fixed costs piled up long after the pandemic waiting list disappeared. As subscriber growth slowed and hardware demand cracked, that model turned from thrilling to unforgiving. The company was still paying for studios, crews, and star talent as if the rocket ship would never descend. But bikes were sitting in warehouses, treadmills were being recalled, and marketing had to work harder just to keep churn from creeping up. Revenue growth decelerated, content costs did not. Margins were squeezed from both sides, and the path to sustainable profitability, once presented as inevitable, started to look more like a wish. Let me take you back to the core tension. Peloton had built a world-class content engine, at times inspiring and at times chilling in its intensity. But in a world where YouTube is full of free workouts, Apple Fitness Plum rides the hardware already in your pocket, and countless low-cost apps promise similar results. Could Peloton charge enough for access to justify that enormous always-on production? The answer would determine whether this was a durable, media-driven fitness empire, or just an expensive show that Wall Street had briefly mistaken for destiny. In that crowded attention market, Peloton wasn't alone for long. There was a time when its glossy bike and charismatic instructors felt like a revelation, a new religion of sweat and subscription. Then the at-home fitness gold rush hit, and suddenly the altar was packed with rival brands, cheaper hardware, and big tech quietly circling overhead. First came the direct challengers. Echelon pushed out connected bikes that looked suspiciously familiar, at a fraction of the price, trading luxury finishes for good enough hardware and aggressive discounts. Nordic Track, through iFit, leaned on decades of experience, bundling treadmills and rowers with guided runs through digital Alps and beaches, selling the fantasy that the world itself was your studio. Around them swarmed a wave of startups, each promising a smarter mirror, a more immersive rower, a more data-driven treadmill, all chasing the same dream, recurring money from monthly content, not just a one-time equipment sale. Because everyone had seen Peloton's valuation rocket, capital poured in. Founders pitched investors on the Peloton of rowing, the Peloton of boxing, the Peloton of yoga, building an echo chamber where every living room was destined to become a boutique gym. It's an example of what happens when one success story rewires expectations for an entire industry. Copycats multiply, prices compress, and the original pioneer finds its once lonely category suddenly packed shoulder to shoulder. Then, above this crowded field, the real giants moved. Apple Fitness Plus arrived not with a new bike, but with something more dangerous, no new hardware at all. It rode on the Apple Watch, the iPhone, the Apple TV already glowing in millions of homes, bundling workout classes into Apple One, alongside music, cloud storage, and TV shows. For a family already paying for that ecosystem, adding guided workouts felt like a rounding error, not a major financial decision. Let me take you back to the logic here. If fitness is just another tile next to your playlists and streaming queue, Peloton is no longer a singular habit. It is merely one app among many. At the low end, the threat was even more ruthless. A generic $300 bike from Amazon, a cheap cadence sensor, and a free or low-cost app could deliver a good enough experience for thousands of budget-conscious riders. No white glove delivery, no celebrity instructor, but also no $2,000 price tag and no $44 monthly bill. For households juggling rent, groceries, and rising subscription fatigue, that trade-off suddenly looked rational, not miserly. And then the quietest competitor of all reopened its doors. Gyms turned the lights back on, outdoor running groups reformed, weekend soccer leagues, pickup basketball, Pilates studios, CrossFit boxes, all pulled people away from the screen and back into real-world sweat. His story is one of screens and software. The story of fitness is older, messier, and doesn't actually require Wi-Fi. Because of that shift, Peloton's once unique value proposition, high-quality at-home classes on a connected device, stopped being a category and became a mere option. In a hybrid world where a person might lift at the gym, run outside, and occasionally ride at home, Peloton was no longer the entire fitness life. It was just one tile on a crowded dashboard, fighting for attention, time, and money. The empire that had seemed inevitable suddenly looked negotiable, and the next challenge would be brutal, surviving in a world where growth was no longer guaranteed and where every new subscriber had to be earned the hard way. There was a time when having a Peloton in your living room felt less like owning exercise equipment and more like holding a golden ticket. Not only was it a $2,000 machine, it was a declaration: money, discipline, tech-forward taste, all welded into one glowing screen in the corner of the home. Let me take you back to late 2019 and early 2020. The bike wasn't just ridden, it was posted. Screenshots of output numbers, sweaty selfies with instructors, humble brags about hitting century rides filled Instagram. The black frame and red stripe became set pieces in influencer apartments, suburban basements, even in the background of Zoom calls. It signaled that life was under control, that while the world outside was messy, here was a person who could wake up at 5:30, clip in, and conquer the day before the first email. During lockdown, that signal intensified. Gyms were closed, streets were quiet, but Peloton bikes were on backorder, and waitlists stretched for months. Inside those four walls, the screen became a portal to a louder, brighter universe. Instructors shouting motivation, leaderboards flying, a digital family of riders all chasing the same high. Peloton wasn't just selling workouts, it was selling belonging, a private empire of sweat and affirmation that, at times inspiring and at times chilling, felt like the only thing standing between people and the emotional gravity of isolation. Then the doors reopened. Commutes crept back, kids' schedules exploded, and thousands of those once precious bikes began to fall silent. The same object that had screamed status and self-mastery now sat in the corner, quietly gathering dust. The psychological weight flipped. Every time someone walked past the unused bike, it didn't say, "You're disciplined," anymore. It whispered, "Remember that promise you made to yourself?" Because of that shift, the cultural jokes wrote themselves. Twitter, TikTok, Reddit filled up with memes about the $2,000 clothes hanger, videos of bikes buried under jackets, laundry, Amazon boxes. People filmed the awkward ritual of stepping over the unused treadmill to get to the couch. The machine that once proved commitment now hinted at overindulgence, impulse, even a little quiet shame. It's an example of what happens when a product built on aspiration collides with the reality of human habits. That new vibe didn't just bruise egos, it damaged the engine Peloton had relied on: word of mouth. When ownership feels glamorous, people talk. When it feels like a guilty secret, they go quiet. Add rising inflation, layoffs, and higher interest rates, and suddenly the pitch: finance this luxury bike and pay a monthly subscription on top, looked less like a smart investment in health and more like another line on a crowded credit card statement. Peloton hadn't only lost market cap, it had lost the halo that made people proud to be seen with its product. And once the glow fades, the question becomes much darker. What happens to a company built on being admired when the culture starts to feel embarrassed instead? There was a time when Peloton's stock chart looked less like a business and more like a religious painting. A perfect diagonal line ascending from the lower left of the screen to the upper right, as if the company had discovered a secret tunnel out of gravity, risk, and common sense. Let me take you back to late 2019. Peloton comes public, a niche fitness name with loyal fans, mocked by some for that infamous holiday ad, but quietly adding subscribers, quietly beating expectations. Then lockdowns hit. Suddenly, every earnings call is the same rhythm. Revenue doubled, subscribers up again, churn lower than anyone thought possible. Each beat is another candle on the altar. The stock surges through $30, $50, $80, racing toward a peak that will briefly value this home workout empire at around $50 billion. Not bad for a company selling bikes and treadmills to families stuck inside their apartments. Every milestone feeds the story. 1 million connected fitness subscribers. Then 2. Waitlists for hardware. Margins expanding as software money piles on top of hardware money. Analysts talk about Peloton as the Netflix of fitness, the future of exercise, a new category-defining platform. Momentum funds pile in, hedge funds ride the trend, retail traders post screenshots of their gains right next to their post-ride selfies. The chart becomes a feedback loop. The higher it goes, the more people believe it deserves to be high. Then the first crack. In 2021, reports surface of injuries on Peloton treadmills, and then the unthinkable, a child's death. The company initially resists a recall, then reverses and pulls back roughly 125,000 machines. Overnight, the stock doesn't just dip, it gashes. The line that only knew up suddenly remembers down. Volatility becomes part of Peloton's daily life. At the same time, gym reopening data starts to creep into earnings calls. Usage trends flatten, guidance gets trimmed. The pandemic rocket ship, it turns out, had borrowed demand from the future. Each lowered forecast is another air pocket in the chart. Each leadership shakeup another sharp leg down. When the founding CEO steps aside and a new turnaround chief arrives, Wall Street hears a different message. This is no longer a perfect growth story. This is a rescue mission. Because momentum investors and hedge funds had crowded into the name on the way up, their exits on the way down are just as ruthless. Algorithmic traders chase every headline. Retail holders, who once felt like early partners in a shared mission, watch their paper wealth evaporate in real time. Employees who joined at the top, who built life plans around stock options, see years of expected wealth disappear between quarterly reports. For many, faith in leadership doesn't just weaken, it shatters. By late 2022, the verdict is written on the screen. From that $50 billion peak, Peloton has lost more than 90% of its value. A company that once looked destined to dominate global fitness now faces a darker question. Not how big its empire can become, but whether it can even survive as an independent business. And as the line on the chart flattens near the bottom, the real work begins. What happens after the miracle phase? When the story has to live without the halo of endless wealth? Because once the miracle phase ends, the question turns brutal. Was Peloton ever a $50 billion company? Or was it a solid $5-10 billion business, temporarily dressed up as the future of fitness? There was a time when that market cap put it above old-line giants that actually made cars, ran hotels, and owned real assets. Peloton made bikes, streamed classes, and sold a story. Wall Street decided that story was worth empire money. Let me take you back to early 2021. Revenue had exploded past $4 billion run rate. Connected fitness subscribers were in the millions, and growth had more than doubled year over year. On paper, it looked unstoppable. But compare those numbers to other companies in the same valuation neighborhood. Firms worth $50 billion tended to throw off billions in free cash flow, post durable gross margins, and dominate markets far beyond a single product. Peloton, by contrast, was still losing money, still reliant on selling expensive hardware, and still paying heavily to acquire each new believer. The margins told the same story. Hardware was capital intensive, subject to recalls, freight costs, and supply chain chaos. Content looked like software, but behaved like media: constant production, celebrity instructors, studio costs. At $50 billion, the market was valuing Peloton like a pure SaaS platform, not a hybrid of manufacturing, logistics, and entertainment. It was priced as if every $12,500 bike was just a Trojan horse for a lifetime of high-margin subscription wealth. Why did that happen? Because money was nearly free. With interest rates near zero and trillions flooding into markets, investors hunted for growth at any price. Pandemic numbers were treated not as a spike, but as a baseline. People stuck at home, gyms closed, wait lists stretching for months. Those conditions were projected forward as if they were a new law of life. It's an example of what happens when a good quarter is mistaken for a new era. To be fair, the bull case wasn't pure fantasy. The upside vision was sweeping. Global expansion into Europe and Asia, multiple product lines from bikes to treadmills to rowers, corporate wellness deals embedding Peloton into office life, and a dominant position in a permanently hybrid fitness world where the gym was just an optional add-on. In that version of reality, Peloton wasn't a bike company. It was the operating system for movement, with instructors as celebrities and households locked in for decades. His story is one of ambition meeting an unusually forgiving financial climate. The truth likely sits in the middle. Peloton built a real brand, changed how millions exercised, and proved that connected fitness wasn't a fad. But the market priced it as if gyms would never reopen, as if competition from cheaper hardware, apps, and old-fashioned barbells would never arrive. When reality finally walked back through the gym doors, the valuation came with it. The next question is harsher. What does the business look like without the illusion of perfection? Without that illusion, the picture changes fast. So let me take you back to an alternate 2020, one where there was no lockdown, no home office, no global excuse to turn the living room into a private gym. In that world, there was a time when Peloton was still impressive, but not miraculous. The bike was a sleek, expensive trophy for lawyers who never left the office before dark, new parents trapped by nap schedules, and boutique fitness fans who loved SoulCycle, energy without SoulCycle commutes. The story is quieter: steady word of mouth, a growing library of classes, a brand that sat comfortably in the premium, slightly smug corner of the fitness universe. Subscriber numbers climb, but they don't explode. Hardware sales grow, but there are no 3-month wait lists, no frantic race to ship every last frame. Revenue doubles, not in a single year, but over several. Wall Street notices, but treats it like what it is: a good business in a big category, not a once-in-a-century empire rewriting human nature. In this timeline, Peloton still raises money, still talks about changing lives, still sells the dream that discipline can be delivered through a screen. But without the crisis, there is no sudden conviction that every household on earth needs a $2,500 bike and a $39 subscription. The valuation grinds upward quarter after quarter instead of leaping into the stratosphere on the back of stay-at-home charts and euphoric forecasts. And because the line is smoother, the decisions are smaller. Management doesn't greenlight a massive US factory on the assumption that demand will stay vertical forever. They don't hire thousands of people in a year. They don't promise Wall Street that growth will look like a rocket, when in reality it was always destined to look more like a staircase. Here the business is less glamorous, but healthier. Fewer recalls from rushing hardware out the door. Fewer angry customers waiting months. fewer desperate promotions to clear warehouses. Cash flow is tighter, discipline is sharper, and the company learns to live with competition from gyms, cheap bikes, and no-frills apps, because those rivals never disappeared in the first place. Then comes the pattern interrupt, the realization that the only thing that changed in the real world was not human nature, but circumstance. People still like being around other people. They still enjoy the clank of barbells, the mirror in a crowded studio, the small social reward of being seen working hard. The pandemic didn't erase that, it just muted it for a while. This alternate timeline makes something uncomfortable very clear. It's an example of what happens when crisis-driven behavior is mistaken for permanent truth, when temporary fear is rebranded as a new religion of at-home devotion. At times inspiring and at times chilling, Peloton's life as a company shows that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to a good business is getting exactly what it wished for. Too much demand, too fast, in exactly the wrong way. There was a time when every ambitious founder wanted their company to be the next Peloton. A cult brand, a soaring stock, a story about turning sweat into software and software into wealth. But Peloton's life on Wall Street did not unfold in a straight line. It rode something older, deeper, and far more ruthless, the hype cycle. In every hype cycle, the pattern is eerily familiar. At first, there is skepticism, eye rolls, quiet dismissal. Then a few success stories spread, money pours in, expectations climb, and suddenly the new thing is not just good, it is destiny. That frenzy crests at a peak where the story outruns reality, where people stop asking, "What is this worth?" and start asking, "What if this is the next empire?" Then comes disappointment, anger, and backlash, followed, if the underlying idea is real, by a slow, painful stabilization at a more honest level. Let me take you back to Peloton's early days, when a $2,000 internet bike on Kickstarter looked like a joke. Gyms already had spin classes. Home treadmills were gathering dust in millions of basements. Commenters mocked the pitch as a rich person's coat rack with Wi-Fi. That was the "this will never work" phase, the cold edge of the hype curve where new ideas look like toys. But a small, devoted community formed. Instructors became celebrities, leaderboards felt addictive, and the company's story hardened. Peloton was not selling hardware, it was selling identity, discipline, and a new kind of digital family. Revenue climbed, classes filled, and media profiles shifted from skepticism to admiration. By the time lockdowns hit, Peloton was perfectly positioned to ride the steepest part of that curve. During the pandemic rocket ship phase, the story went fully vertical. Waitlists stretched for months, subscribers doubled, and the market cap surged toward $50 billion. Analysts spoke about owning the future of fitness, the same way they once spoke about .com portals owning the internet. It's an example of what happens when a good business is suddenly treated like a flawless one, when recent growth gets projected forward as if nothing in life ever reverts to normal. Then gyms reopen. Demand that had been pulled forward vanished. Recalls and supply missteps hit the headlines, and the same media that once praised Peloton's genius now chronicled its fall. The narrative flipped from revolution to bubble with almost comic speed. This is the disillusionment stage, the same valley that swallowed 3D printing darlings, marginal .coms, meme coins, and ambitious EV startups that promised too much, too fast, to too many investors chasing the next miracle. Underneath that drama sit simple human forces. FOMO pushes investors to buy because everyone else is buying. Media amplifies the most dramatic success stories. People anchor on the recent past and extend straight lines into the future. At times inspiring and at times chilling, this is how money, attention, and belief move together. Understanding hype cycles is not about sneering at believers. It is about seeing when a compelling story has drifted too far from cash flows, customers, and concrete reality, and asking the harder question, what is left when the excitement drains away? When the excitement drains away, something quieter takes its place. Behavior. Not the imagined future self on a vision board, but the real person in sweatpants who has to decide, right now, whether to press join class or next episode. Peloton's empire was built on that tiny decision point, repeated millions of times a day. There was a time when bringing a gleaming $2,000 bike into the living room felt like a life reset. New equipment, fresh routines, a charismatic instructor shouting your name through the screen. The first PRs, the first badges, the first time a friend texted, "You were on the leaderboard?" It felt like power over the chaos of lockdown life, a private boutique studio with no commute and no strangers watching. For many families, this was the most expensive piece of fitness equipment they had ever owned, and the guilt alone powered the first few weeks. Then the honeymoon clock started ticking. Let me take you back to those early months. Every ride was an event, every new instructor a discovery, every live-streamed class a shared ritual. But human motivation is ruthless in its own way. Novelty fades, the bike becomes furniture. Because there is no appointment with a trainer, no physical drive to a building, no front desk staff giving a look when you vanish, the workout quietly slides from non-negotiable to if there's time. This is habit decay. Without external cues like packing a gym bag, leaving the house, or meeting a friend in the weight room, the workout has to compete with email, children, dinner, and the infinite scroll. The same phone that launches the Peloton app also launches TikTok, Slack, and YouTube. One notification at the wrong moment, and the 45-minute climb turns into a 45-minute scroll. It's an example of what happens when a product asks people to fight their own environment every single day, because the environment is doing its own quiet work. That living room is where people watch TV, eat takeout, argue with family, and fall asleep on the couch. Now it is also the gym. The brain never fully flips into workout mode because nothing around it changes. No different lighting, no different smell, no different people. Just the same wall, the same couch, the same pile of laundry staring back during the cooldown. To Peloton's credit, the company understood this problem better than most. It layered on community, accountability, and gamification. Leaderboards, streaks, shoutouts, hashtags, milestone rides. Instructors remembered birthdays, referenced members' kids, turned a metal frame into a social life raft. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the system treated attention like oxygen and tried to make missing a ride feel like breaking a promise. Yet even that was not enough to fully overpower deeper human tendencies. Procrastination, novelty seeking, the quiet drift back to comfort once fear recedes. When lockdowns hit, there was a shock strong enough to rewire daily life. When gyms reopened, that shock dissolved, and old routines flowed back in like water. Any business built on changing daily habits at scale is not just fighting competitors, it is fighting inertia. Peloton's rise and fall shows how stubborn existing patterns are once the crisis passes, and sets up a harder question for the entire fitness industry. What happens when the world wants hybrid convenience, but human psychology still prefers the path of least resistance? There was a time when fitness meant choosing a side. You were a gym person, a runner, a boutique class devotee. One place, one routine, one identity. That world is gone. Let me take you back to the quiet, awkward months after lockdowns faded. Offices reopened on odd schedules. kids were half on Zoom and half on buses, and workouts followed the same fractured pattern. Mornings might start with a 20-minute bodyweight session in the living room. Lunch meant a brisk walk outside. Evenings were split between a couple days at the gym, and every now and then a splurge on a boutique class when friends could finally coordinate calendars again. Life stopped obeying a single script, and so did exercise. Because of that messy reality, the winners were not the loudest brands, but the most flexible ones. ClassPass, once a niche pass to boutique studios, suddenly made sense as a way to sample everything. Yoga one week, boxing the next. A Pilates studio near the office when the commute came back. Traditional gyms rushed to bolt on digital training apps, on-demand classes, and connected equipment, turning a simple keycard membership into a cloud account that followed members from the squat rack to their phone screen. Even scrappy apps that only offered timers, habit tracking, or guided runs gained power, because they traveled with the user through every context, quietly stitching together a hybrid routine. Peloton had not been built for that world. Peloton had been built to replace it. The pitch was total. Sell the bike, capture the subscription, become the gym, the studio, the personal trainer, the community. One platform, one empire. One monthly charge that, for a while, looked like an unbreakable lock on customers' money and attention. But when gyms reopened and sidewalks filled, Peloton's place shifted from everything to one more option on a crowded home screen. To survive that downgrade, the company had to change its story. It pushed non-equipment content, strength, yoga, meditation, outdoor audio runs that asked members to take Peloton with them into the park instead of keeping them chained to the bike. It partnered with hotels, turning anonymous fitness rooms into mini Peloton showrooms. It signed corporate wellness deals, slipping into HR portals and employee perks. Every move had the same goal: stay present when the user was off the bike, out of the house, away from the screen. At times inspiring and at times chilling, it's an example of what happens when a company built for domination is forced to compete for scraps of attention in a hybrid world. Because when variety becomes the norm, loyalty becomes fragile, and pricing power evaporates fast. The question now hangs over Peloton and every digital fitness brand that followed its path. In a landscape defined by choice, can any single platform ever command the devotion, the money, and the power Peloton once briefly held? Or was that $50 billion moment a one-time illusion that will never return? There was a time when Peloton's answer to that question was simple: buy the bike, join the cult, never leave. But as the $50 billion dream cracked, the company tried to rewrite its own story. If the hardware throne was wobbling, the new fantasy was even bigger. Peloton would not just be a bike company, it would be a fitness operating system for your entire life. Whammy, so let me take you back to the moment the pivot began. Gyms were reopening, waitlists were shrinking, and the once mythical Bike Plus started looking like a very expensive clothes rack. Inside Peloton, the response was to push something lighter, more scalable, and far less dependent on supply chains: the app. Suddenly, the spotlight moved from the metal frame in your living room to the content library living on your phone. Strength classes, yoga flows, meditation sessions, outdoor audio runs that use GPS instead of a Peloton screen, even Pilates and Barra. The message was clear. You didn't need a $2,500 machine to belong to the empire anymore. Just a screen, a subscription, and a willingness to sweat. To make that work, Peloton began playing with money. App-only tiers at a lower price to lure casual users. Premium tiers that unlocked advanced metrics and all-access classes. hardware plus subscription bundles that blurred the line between buying an object and joining a service. At one point, the same brand that once mocked cheap bikes was running promotions where the hardware felt like an installment plan add-on to justify a recurring fee. The company was trying to segment its flock: tourists on the app, true believers on the bike, corporate clients on bulk deals. Partnerships became the new land grab. Peloton treadmills in hotel gyms, so business travelers could keep chasing their favorite instructor on the road. Bikes in luxury apartment buildings as a selling point alongside rooftop pools. Corporate wellness deals that put Peloton screens in office fitness centers, promising healthier employees and, conveniently, a new funnel of potential subscribers. It was a quiet invasion. Even if you never bought a bike, Peloton would appear in your hotel, your lobby, your workplace. But this second act came with a different kind of enemy. On one side, free or bundled content from tech giants, Apple Fitness, folded into a larger ecosystem, YouTube trainers pumping out workouts at no cost, meditation apps offering calm for the price of a latte. On the other, hardware skeptics who were already suspicious of paying for a bike now being asked to pay monthly for software they believed should be free. Because of its premium origin story and boutique pricing, Peloton had to walk a tightrope, broaden access without collapsing the aura that made its brand feel elite. Too open and the prestige vanished. Too closed and growth stalled. His story is one of war metaphors, and here Peloton faced a brutal truth. This pivot meant fighting a second, very different war than the one it had trained for. The first campaign was about selling a beautiful object and wrapping it in community. The new one was about surviving in a crowded, low-margin attention market where content is everywhere and loyalty is nowhere. And as the company rushed to reinvent itself as a platform, the deeper question became unavoidable. Could Peloton change its nature fast enough without losing the very identity that made people care in the first place? That question didn't just haunt Peloton's executives. It haunted anyone who had paid a perfect price for a merely good business. There was a time when Wall Street acted as if Peloton wasn't a fitness company at all, but the inevitable empire of exercise, destined to sit on every living room wall and harvest subscription money forever. The strange part is the core was real. The brand was strong, almost cult-like. Users were engaged, taking dozens of classes a month, quoting instructors like family. Revenue growth was not a mirage. It more than doubled in those lockdown quarters. This was not a penny stock fantasy, but the valuation, up near $50 billion, assumed something far more fragile: flawless execution, zero serious competition, and a world where people never went back to the gym, the office, or even the sidewalk. Let me take you back to those pandemic earnings calls. Demand was unprecedented. Hardware wait lists stretched for weeks. Margins swelled as factories ran hot, and marketing looked effortless. Investors took those numbers, drawn from the most abnormal environment in modern consumer life, and drew a straight line into the future. It's an example of what happens when temporary extremes are treated as a new law of nature. In statistics, that's called overfitting. In markets, it's called paying too much. Peloton's peak price baked in the idea that every quarter would look like April 2020, that every bike in every spare bedroom represented permanent, unshakable behavior. When gyms reopened, when commutes returned, when the dog needed walking again, reality quietly reminded everyone that human habits revert toward the mean. That is where the margin of safety should live. Not in believing a company has no competitors, but in assuming they will. Not in assuming every customer stays forever, but in allowing for churn, boredom, and a cheaper bike on Amazon. A margin of safety is the gap between the glowing story and the price you actually pay, the space that protects you when recalls hit, when a factory plan gets canceled, when demand was pulled forward rather than born anew. Because Peloton showed something uncomfortable, loving a product and overpaying for the stock are two very different experiences. Millions loved the rides, the instructors, the feeling of belonging. Many of those same believers watched their shares lose more than 90% of their value. Narratives about the future of fitness drowned out sober questions like, what happens when this is just a good business with normal growth? His story is one of pandemics and treadmills, not oil fields and railroads, but the lesson rhymes. At times inspiring and at times chilling, Peloton's boom and bust will not be the last. The next hype cycle is already forming around you, promising wealth, power, and a perfect future. The only question is whether investors will price it like a business, or once again like a flawless dream. There was a time when Peloton looked less like a fitness company and more like prophecy fulfilled. For years, they'd been the strange outsider, trying to convince the world that people would pay thousands of dollars to ride a bike in their living room and shout back at an instructor on a screen. Then 2020 hit, the doors of the gym slammed shut, and overnight the entire planet was forced to live inside Peloton's vision. Waitlists stretched for months, revenue more than doubled. The subscriber base exploded into the millions. Not only did the company's value rocket toward $50 billion, for a brief, surreal moment, Peloton was worth more than Ford and Hyatt combined. To the leadership team, this felt like vindication. Years of skepticism from analysts, from old-school gym executives, from friends and family suddenly flipped into admiration. The world had finally caught up. But here is where the trap opens. When a rare external shock sends every metric vertical, it is dangerously easy to believe the story that this was all skill, strategy, genius. The boardrooms fill with charts. The charts show perfect curves, and the human brain does what it loves to do. It draws a straight line through the best year of your life and quietly assumes that line will continue forever. It's an example of what happens when circumstance and competence get blended into one flattering narrative. Founders watching from the outside need a different habit. When the numbers are on fire, the real question is, what happens when the world isn't? Let me take you back to those peak pandemic forecasts. Demand models assume that elevated growth, low churn, and sky-high engagement were the new normal. But few inside the empire were running the colder scenario. Gyms reopen, people travel again, families relocate, and the urgency of a $2,500 bike fades. Instead, Peloton overbuilt. They hired aggressively, expanded headcount, committed to their own massive US factory, locked in supply as if shortages would last forever. Capacity rose to match a once-in-a-century spike, not a decade-long trend. When treadmills were recalled after tragic injuries and a child's death, when shipping delays turned delight into frustration, and when the world finally stepped back outside, that capacity did not magically shrink. Suddenly, the heroic metrics looked less like destiny and more like what they had always been. A demand pull forward, boosted by fear, boredom, and closed doors. Growth slowed, churn ticked up, cheaper competitors flooded in. The same decisions that had seemed bold and visionary now looked reckless, even ruthless, as layoffs hit and projects were canceled. For entrepreneurs, the lesson is brutally simple. The true test of a business is not how it behaves in a hurricane tailwind, but how it stands when the wind turns and blows straight into its face. The next section will follow that turn, and what Peloton had to do once the music stopped and the room went quiet. When the music stopped for Peloton, the silence was louder than any instructor shouting through the screen, because underneath the business story was something more fragile: identity. There was a time when owning that bike was not just about cardio, it was a declaration of who you were. Peloton didn't just sell metal and software, it sold a story about life. If the old treadmill in the basement whispered, "I tried," the gleaming Peloton in the living room screamed, disciplined, successful, on the rise. The price tag helped. $2,000 plus a monthly fee turned a fitness tool into a luxury signal, a way to tell yourself and everyone who walked through the door that you belonged to a certain empire of people who crushed 5 a.m. rides before emails and school drop-offs. And for a while, that story felt true. New owners unboxed the bike like a holy object, posted their first ride on social media, joined leaderboards with usernames that sounded more like alter egos than accounts. The instructors knew this and leaned into it, talking about power, resilience, family, even wealth, until a 45-minute workout felt at times inspiring and at times chilling in how completely it tried to rewrite your sense of self. Then, something quieter happened. Work got busy. Gyms reopened, kids needed rides. The same bike that once symbolized ruthless discipline started gathering dust. The login streak broke, the shoes stayed clipped in, and the tribe you had joined kept riding without you. That's where the emotional hangover begins, when the identity you bought stops matching the behavior you live. Because when a purchase is tied to who you are, skipping a workout isn't just skipping a workout. It's a tiny crack in the story. Maybe not that disciplined, maybe not that different from the person with the old clothes hanger treadmill. Shame creeps in, and strangely, the more shame, the less the bike gets used. It's an example of what happens when a tool quietly turns into a mirror. Peloton is not alone in this. High-end phones, smartwatches, luxury wellness gadgets, even productivity apps now sell identity as much as utility. His story is one of oil and railroads. Today's stories are about rings closed, steps counted, greens powdered. The promise is the same: buy this, and life will finally align with the person you imagine. So here's the uncomfortable question. Are you buying tools that actually fit your real habits, time, and constraints, or symbols you hope will magically drag you into a new personality? Before the next big swipe of the card, let me take you back to 2 years from now. Where is that object in your home? On, in use, integrated into daily routines? Or silent, pushed into a corner, a very expensive reminder of a version of you that never quite arrived? Because the way millions answered that question with Peloton didn't just reshape living rooms, it reshaped the company's fate. And the next part of this story shows what happens when that identity machine starts running in reverse. When that identity machine runs in reverse, the media rarely misses its chance to narrate it. There was a time when headlines didn't just report on Peloton, they crowned it. The death of gyms. The future of fitness is at home. The new normal is here. Each story framed Peloton as the inevitable winner in a world where no one would ever share a sweaty dumbbell with strangers again. Those pieces had a rhythm, a lockdown photo, a quote from a newly converted rider, a chart of Peloton's $50 billion valuation climbing, like a hill ride in a Cody Rigsby class. Gyms were presented as relics of a primitive life, while Peloton was the sleek, sanitized empire of the living room. It wasn't just a company making money, it was supposedly proof that the entire fitness industry had been rewired forever. Let me take you back to that phrase, the new normal. It sounds calm, almost comforting, but it hides something powerful. New normal stories are clean. They offer heroes and losers, simple plots, and the illusion that the future has already been written. A virus appears, people buy bikes, the world changes, the end. No messy questions about habit formation, boredom, or what happens when the weather gets nice again. For journalists under pressure to explain chaos in real time, that narrative is tempting. Short-term numbers look explosive. The stock price soars. Executives talk about 10 years of adoption pulled forward in 10 months. And suddenly, this isn't just a business story. It's a civilization shift. At times inspiring and at times chilling, it's an example of what happens when temporary behavior is mistaken for permanent destiny. Then, as gyms reopened and Peloton's growth slowed, the same outlets discovered a new angle: Schadenfreude. The tone flipped overnight. The company that had been praised for saving people from pandemic isolation was now mocked for hubris, overbuilding factories, and believing its own press. Long, breathless profiles about visionary leadership quietly gave way to snarky recaps of a stock chart collapsing more than 90%. The underlying business story was nuanced. Demand pulled forward, safety recalls, competition from cheaper bikes, and old-fashioned barbells. But nuance doesn't travel as fast as a morality play. So Peloton became a character in a cautionary tale about arrogance, easy money, and the danger of thinking a living room could replace every gym on Earth. This is where the viewer needs a different lens. When a crisis hits and someone declares with total certainty that this is the new normal, that certainty itself should be a warning sign. Short-term data is loud, distorted by fear, boredom, and constraints that will not last. A healthier question isn't, is this the new normal? But under what conditions does this behavior persist, and when does it fade? When offices reopen, when childcare returns, when people remember they like being around other humans, who still rides at home 5 times a week, and who quietly cancels. The next phase of Peloton's life will be decided by those quieter answers, not by the loudest headlines. There was a time when Peloton looked untouchable, when the bike in the living room felt like the center of a new fitness empire, and the $50 billion valuation seemed, if not reasonable, at least inevitable. That world is gone. What's left is something messier, smaller, and far more interesting. Because the challenges are not cosmetic. They are structural, heavy, and at times chilling. Peloton is loaded with obligations from the boom years, paying for factories it never fully used, leases it doesn't need, and a workforce it had to shrink. Competition is everywhere. Cheaper bikes on Amazon, sleek apps from Apple and Nike, old-fashioned gyms slashing prices. Add in safety recalls that put a child's death on the front page, and suddenly, the aspirational brand about life and health is associated with danger, delays, and drama. Reigniting growth in a core market that bought early, upgraded once, and now has other options is brutally hard. And yet, this is not a company in poverty. Its story is one of excess, correction, and then a stubborn middle chapter. Millions of bikes and treadmills still sit in homes, quietly throwing off subscription money every month. A core group still rides, still cries with instructors, still treats the leaderboard like a second family. The name Peloton is etched into culture in a way most hardware brands never achieve. The content is genuinely high quality, produced at a level that many streaming platforms would envy. That installed base is both anchor and lifeline. So what does the next decade look like? One future is almost boring. Peloton settles into being a mid-size subscription business with modest hardware sales, a loyal niche, and steady, if unspectacular, cash flow. Not a rocket ship, not a meme, Just a normal company that sells workouts and earns a living. Another path is absorption. A larger tech or fitness player decides the brand, the instructors, and the data are worth more inside a bigger machine, and Peloton becomes a division rather than an empire. The darkest path is the slow fade, where churn quietly outruns new signups, hardware ages out, and the bike becomes the next Bowflex, still in the basement, no longer in the conversation. Here's the crucial point. Not a $50 billion company does not mean worth zero. Many great businesses live long, healthy lives at a fraction of their peak wealth. It's an example of what happens when a good business is priced like a perfect one, and then reality walks back in on a treadmill. So let me take you back to the real question Peloton now embodies. Can the pandemic's favorite brands reinvent themselves for a world that has moved on? Or will they be remembered as relics of a very weird time? Peloton's fate will be one of the first and loudest answers, because Peloton isn't alone. There was a time when an entire generation of pandemic winners looked untouchable, when their founders talked like they were building permanent empires, not temporary shelters from a public health crisis. Let me take you back to Zoom in the spring of 2020. Overnight, a quiet enterprise video tool turned into digital oxygen. Schools, courts, weddings, funerals, family dinners, billion-dollar board meetings, all crammed into the same little grid of faces. Revenue exploded. Daily users jumped into the hundreds of millions, and the stock rocketed as if every conversation on Earth would now live on Zoom forever. Then offices reopened, hybrid work replaced total lockdown, and companies started asking a very old question. Do all these meetings need to be video calls? Growth slowed, the share price deflated, and the market was reminded that emergency behavior is not the same as long-term preference. Netflix followed a similar arc, only with better lighting. Lockdown households around the world paid for another screen to escape the anxiety outside. In 2020 alone, Netflix added tens of millions of subscribers. Its stock surged, and investors talked as if every cable customer on Earth would inevitably end up in its arms. But then came saturation in rich markets, cheaper rivals, Disney and others pouring money into competing platforms, and the realization that streaming growth is not infinite, it is a race. When Netflix finally reported a rare subscriber loss in 2022, billions in market value vanished in days. Nothing about the product had suddenly become terrible. The illusion of endless linear growth had. Peloton's story fits the same pattern, at times inspiring and at times chilling. All three companies mistook a world under house arrest for a cleanroom experiment in consumer desire. Investors modeled emergency usage as if it were voluntary. Executives expanded as if the clock would never run out, and Wall Street priced that fantasy as if risk had been outlawed. It's an example of what happens when a temporary shock is treated like a permanent rewiring of human nature. But the differences mattered. Zoom and Netflix sell pure software. Once the code and content are built, serving an extra user costs almost nothing. When growth cooled, they could cut marketing, trim projects, and still throw off cash. Peloton, by contrast, lived in the heavy world of hardware. Bikes, treadmills, factories, warehouses, recalls, all demanding money up front long before it flowed back. So when demand snapped back to gyms and parks, Peloton's correction was more brutal. Excess inventory piled up, a new factory had to be canceled, and the same leverage that magnified its rise magnified its fall. The pandemic hadn't rewritten the laws of consumer behavior. It had only suspended them. Companies that forgot that lesson paid the price, and Peloton would pay it in the most tangible way possible: steel, leases, and layoffs. And yet, the story isn't finished. And yet, the story isn't finished. There was a time when a $50 billion price tag on Peloton didn't feel insane. It felt inevitable. One company, one screen, one monthly charge on your credit card, owning the future of fitness from your living room. Not only was it worth more than old-line car makers and hotel chains, it was treated as something higher, cleaner, almost immune to gravity. Let me take you back to that feeling for a second. Empty streets, closed gyms, wait lists for a $2,500 bike that might arrive in 3 months if you were lucky. Wall Street ran the numbers, saw revenue more than doubling, millions of connected subscribers, and did what it always does when fear meets free money. It projected a straight line to the horizon and called it destiny. But destiny had a return date stamped on the box. Peloton's life in those years is a parable. His story is one of genuine ambition fused with something darker, cheap capital, a once-in-a-century crisis, and a belief that if a business helps people, the price paid for it can never be too high. The company did create real value. It helped millions move more, lose weight, feel less alone in small apartments and quiet suburbs. It gave some families a ritual, a schedule, a voice in the corner saying, "Keep going," when the rest of the world had stopped. At the same time, it overreached. Factories announced, then canceled. Safety concerns brushed aside until a child's death forced a recall. Hardware pushed as if hardware margins would last forever. Executives talked like they were building an empire, while the unit economics whispered a different story. It's an example of what happens when a good business is priced like a perfect one. Because the world did what it always does. Gyms reopened, sidewalks filled. People remembered that they liked leaving the house, that motivation fades, that a $39 subscription feels different once the emergency ends. Competitors flooded in with cheaper bikes, cheaper apps, and old-school barbells that never needed a software update. The same leverage that magnified Peloton's rise now magnified every mistake, every recall, every canceled lease. Reality, patient and ruthless, reasserted itself. The laws of money, of demand, of human behavior walked back in like a gym manager turning the lights on after closing time. The valuation collapsed by more than 90%, and the dream of owning the future of fitness shrank into a fight for survival. So the question now isn't whether Peloton was good or bad. It was both, at times inspiring and at times chilling. The real question is what everyone watching chooses to learn from it. As consumers, in what illusions we buy. As founders, in how far we let the story run ahead of the numbers. As investors, in how we behave the next time a crisis, a screen, and a promise of endless growth line up perfectly. Because this won't be the last time. And the next version of Peloton is already being built, somewhere, right now. So now the camera quietly turns back on the person who actually decides how this story ends next. The viewer, not Wall Street, not Peloton's board. The question moves from market cap to living room. During those long lockdown months, did a bike, a rower, a treadmill, or a stack of shiny dumbbells appear in your home? And are they still being used, or are they holding up laundry in a very expensive way? There was a time when ordering a $2,000 bike felt like buying a ticket out of chaos. No commute, no shared air, no waiting for a squat rack while someone filmed a set for social media. At-home fitness promised total control. Lower long-term cost than a boutique studio, extreme convenience, and for some, a strange new family. Instructors calling your name, virtual high fives, a leaderboard that turned the spare bedroom into a tiny digital empire of sweat and status. But control has its price. The same convenience that removes excuses also removes witnesses. No one sees if the workout gets skipped. if the daily ride silently becomes maybe on weekends and then next month. The subscription keeps billing. The hardware keeps staring. It's an example of what happens when motivation was rented from a screen instead of built in real life. On the other end is the old institution Peloton was supposed to replace: the gym, loud music, shared equipment, people who are stronger, weaker, older, younger, all moving in the same fluorescent box. Cost is recurring, the commute is real, the sweat is public, yet accountability is baked in. A trainer asks where you've been, a friend texts when you miss leg day. For many, the simple friction of leaving the house is exactly what locks the habit in place. Between those poles sits the hybrid life that most consumers quietly drifted into once the world reopened. A cheap bike at home plus a barbell at the gym, a Peloton app for hotel rooms plus a local class on weekends. Some days the living room wins on convenience. Other days, the ritual of scanning a key fob and walking past rows of treadmills is what finally gets the workout done. So the honest question is not which environment looks best on Instagram, or which one a $50 billion valuation said was the future. It's which place actually makes you show up 3, 4, 5 times a week, when work is busy, when family is demanding, when nobody is watching. Because habits are not permanent. Work shifts, kids arrive, injuries happen, cities change. Let me take you back to your own timeline for a second. College, first job, remote work, back to the office. The right answer probably moved each time. At times inspiring and at times chilling, Peloton's rise and fall is just a reminder that flexibility beats dogma. So where are you now on that spectrum? At-home loyalist, gym diehard, or hybrid nomad? Does Peloton or any at-home platform still have real power in your routine? Or has the empire in the corner been quietly dethroned? Drop a comment with what actually keeps you consistent, because the next fitness revolution will be built on those real behaviors, not just the next perfect pitch deck. There was a time when any company that mentioned at-home revolution and subscription in the same sentence could raise billions overnight. Peloton was the poster child, but it will not be the last. The next time a stock chart goes vertical on the promise that human behavior has permanently changed, remember the bike in the corner and the empire that looked invincible until the gym doors quietly swung back open. So let me take you back to the checklist every investor wishes had been taped to their screen in 2020. First question, are the current numbers being driven by abnormal conditions? Peloton's waitlists, its exploding revenue, its millions of connected subscribers were real, but they were also locked in a house with nowhere else to go. When revenue more than doubles in a year because the outside world has shut down, that is not a new normal. That is a pressure cooker. The moment the lid lifts, behavior can escape. Second question, is the valuation assuming perfection? At $50 billion, Peloton was priced as if every bike would ship on time, every treadmill would be safe, every customer would stay forever, and every competitor would politely sit down. Instead, there were recalls, canceled factories, rising churn, and cheaper rivals racing in. It's an example of what happens when a good business is treated like a flawless one, and any crack in the story turns into a canyon in the stock price. Third question, does the business model actually match the narrative? Peloton sold heavy hardware that breaks, ships slowly, and eats capital, while being praised as a pure software subscription miracle. Hardware versus software, one-time sale versus recurring money, low-margin metal versus high-margin code. When the story is Netflix for fitness, but the balance sheet screams furniture company with a side app, that tension eventually demands a reckoning. Because when interest rates are near zero and capital is flooding into a hot sector, the phrase, This time it's different, starts to sound righteous instead of dangerous. His story is one of investors who forgot that cheap money can make any growth curve look holy for a few quarters. Then rates rise, the tide goes out, and even the most charismatic instructor cannot spin a negative cash flow into a sustainable life. Missing the top of that mania is not a tragedy. Watching a position fall 80 or 90% because the narrative felt more real than the numbers can be. The ruthless part is that markets do not refund belief, they only mark to reality. So as you look at today's darlings in AI, in EVs, in whatever new empire is being crowned this month, use the checklist. Then head to the comments and name the companies you think are in their Peloton phase right now, and why. In the next section, the story turns from warning to opportunity, how to ride hype cycles without letting them ride you into the ground. Because Peloton isn't just a story about a bike, a screen, and a $50 billion peak valuation. It's a story about us, about how quickly an anxious society can swing from one extreme to the other, declaring a permanent revolution one year and quietly drifting back to old habits the next. There was a time when every headline seemed certain. The office was dead, gyms were fossils, cities were finished. Work, life, exercise, all of it would be streamed from a spare bedroom forever. Peloton, Zoom, and a handful of other pandemic darlings weren't just businesses. They were presented as the blueprint for a new empire of at-home everything. No commute, no crowds, no waiting for a treadmill. Just subscriptions, convenience, and the promise that this, finally, was the future. Then the doors opened. Offices flickered back on. Bars filled. People went back to crowded weight rooms and sweaty spin studios they had loudly sworn they would never need again. Because underneath all the confident talk about a new normal was something more stubborn, the human craving for in-person energy, for separation between work and home, for the simple power of leaving the house. Let me take you back to those early lockdown months. Fear in the air, markets in freefall, daily routines shattered. In that kind of chaos, certainty feels like oxygen. So when a narrative appears that says, this is it, this is permanent, this is the way life will be now, it can feel comforting, even if it's ruthless in how it erases nuance. Peloton's rocket ship attached itself to that craving for clarity. The story wasn't just that demand was pulled forward. The story was that the old world was over. It's an example of what happens when a real trend gets inflated into destiny. Remote work is real. Connected fitness is real. Digital subscriptions are real, but so is reversion. So is the gravity of long-term behavior, the decades of muscle memory that pull people back toward offices, classrooms, and yes, crowded gyms with terrible music and broken fans. The mistake wasn't believing in change. The mistake was believing in only change. A more grounded mindset sounds less exciting on an earnings call, but works better in real life. Expect innovation, but also expect the comeback of old habits. Believe some meetings will stay on Zoom, and some workouts will stay on Peloton, while also accepting that rush hour traffic and January gym lines are not going quietly into poverty. The future is rarely either or. It is usually an untidy both. So here's the mirror. When you watched Peloton's rise, did you feel hype, fear, or nostalgia? Did you cheer the death of the old world, dread it, or secretly hope everything would snap back? Because your answer says as much about your own relationship to change and to money, power, and comfort as it does about any CEO. In the next section, the question becomes personal. How do you use that self-knowledge to navigate the next wave without getting pulled under? So let me take you back to the beginning of this particular empire. There was a time when Peloton was a scrappy outsider selling $2,000 bikes to a niche crowd that hated gyms and loved being told to work harder in their own living rooms. No one on Wall Street cared. The company was a curiosity, not a king. Then the doors of the world slammed shut. Lockdowns hit, gyms went dark, and a brand that had been fighting for relevance suddenly looked like a lifeline. Waitlists stretched for months, revenue more than doubled, and a company that sold hardware and hype was talked about like a pure software rocket ship. In early 2021, Peloton was worth around $50 billion, more valuable than some legacy automakers and hotel chains combined, all built on the idea that the living room was now the permanent center of your fitness life. But his story is one of gravity as much as ascent. Because when treadmills started injuring people, when a child died and 125,000 machines had to be recalled, the myth of frictionless growth met the cold reality of physical risk. When Peloton overbuilt factories, filled warehouses, and then watched demand evaporate as gyms reopened, the dream of infinite scale turned into an inventory glut. Leadership changed, costs were slashed, and the once unstoppable savior of pandemic fitness looked less like a revolution and more like a very human company that had flown too close to the sun. It's an example of what happens when ambition, belief, and cheap money collide with a global crisis. Expectations inflate faster than any real-world business can deliver. A good subscription model gets priced like a flawless one. Temporary behavior gets treated like destiny. Founders start to feel like prophets. Investors convince themselves that every spike is a new normal. Consumers let a logo tell them who they are until the next logo arrives. The lessons are blunt. Don't mistake a crisis spike for a structural shift just because the chart looks like a miracle. Don't price a solid business like it will never hit a wall, never face competition, never make a mistake. And don't outsource your identity to a brand, no matter how loud the instructors yell your name through the screen, because that brand will move on the second the market demands it. At times inspiring and at times chilling, Peloton is neither pure villain nor pure victim. Real innovation met real demand. Real missteps met real consequences. Out of that collision came not a $50 billion god, but a humbled survivor trying to earn its place in a world that went back outside. The question now is what you do with this story the next time a company is crowned the future of everything, and the numbers look untouchable, because in the next section, the hype won't be on the screen. It will be sitting in your own portfolio, your own habits, your own life. So now the market has spoken, the empire has shrunk, and the question shifts from Peloton's fate to yours. Because this isn't just a story about a bike, a screen, and a $50 billion dream. It's about how you, personally, move your body, spend your money, and chase or resist the next wave of hype. There was a time when getting a Peloton felt like joining a secret society. Waitlists, invite codes, instructors who knew your leaderboard name. Did you live through that? Do you own a Peloton, a tonal, a mirror, an Apple Fitness subscription, any connected fitness device at all? Or maybe there's a dusty bike in the corner right now, a silent monument to a very intense month in 2020. When gyms reopened and the world finally went back outside, what happened in your life? Did the at-home rides keep their grip on you? Or did the sound of plates clanking in a crowded weight room pull you back? Be specific. Was there a moment, an email from your gym, a friend's text, a New Year's resolution when you switched from living in the app to driving to the parking lot again? Some people now live in a hybrid world, a Tuesday night spin class in the spare bedroom, a Saturday morning deadlift session at the gym, a run in the park when the weather cooperates. Others went fully back to fluorescent lights and crowded locker rooms. Where do you stand? Home, gym, or hybrid? And why? The more detailed the story, the more it reveals about how real humans behave when the crisis ends and habit has to fight convenience, boredom, and time. Let me take you back to another arena, the market. Investors watching this know that Peloton didn't just sell workouts, it sold a narrative of endless subscription wealth. Did you ever own the stock? Did you watch it roar past car companies and hotel chains and think, this is the future of everything? Or did the valuation feel like a treadmill set a little too fast? Looking back now, what would you do differently? Buy earlier, sell sooner, avoid it entirely, or double down when it crashed? Share the thinking, not just the trade. The logic you used at the time is the part that quietly shapes the next decision. Because his story is one of booms and busts, at times inspiring and at times chilling, Peloton has also become a quiet battlefield of explanations. Was it mostly a victim of circumstance when gyms reopened, of its own decisions around recalls and overbuilding, or of investor overexuberance that priced a good business like a flawless one? Argue your case in the comments, but keep it ruthless on the ideas and respectful to the people. It's an example of what happens when consumer behavior, technology, and Wall Street belief all collide at once. Every comment here gets read, and many end up shaping future case studies on the next can't-lose empire the market swears will last forever. So where do you stand in the Peloton story? And what will you do when the next bike, app, or empire comes calling? There was a time when a $50 billion valuation felt like destiny for Peloton, not a warning sign. Today, its rise and fall is just one chapter in a much bigger story about how modern markets turn ordinary companies into temporary gods, then drag them back down to earth when reality and revenue no longer match the myth. Because Peloton is not alone. His story is one of a pandemic rocket ship, but there were other rockets on that same launch pad. Video platforms that tripled overnight, e-commerce darlings that look like they would own your entire life, work-from-home software crowned as permanent kings. Each one sold comfort, control, and endless growth. Each one discovered what happens when the world reopens and the narrative has to survive contact with a Tuesday morning. So let me take you back to that moment in 2020 when pandemic winner was a badge of honor. Not only was Peloton worth more than old line giants, it was mentioned in the same breath as the future of fitness, the future of media, even the future of community. Now, if this breakdown helped you see through the shine on that bike, the logical next step is to watch how the same pattern played out with another darling. The next video in this series dives into a different lockdown champion that Wall Street swore would reshape everyday life, right up until user growth stalled and the empire built on perfect projections began to crack. That episode takes the same narrative-driven path. The origin myth, the moment the money spigot opened, the ruthless push for scale, and then the slow, almost invisible shift from this can't lose to why did everyone think this could never lose? It's an example of what happens when hype cycles, cheap capital, and very human dreams about wealth collide in the same boardroom. If this kind of long-form, at times inspiring and at times chilling analysis is valuable to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The next time a fitness app, a streaming platform, or an AI empire gets crowned at $50 billion on day one, the full story will not be on the front page. It will be buried in footnotes, earnings calls, and the quiet decisions made far away from the marketing slogans. Share this video with someone who bought a Peloton, works in tech, or trades stocks for fun on their phone. Not as a told you so, but as a conversation starter about how money, belief, and timing can shape an entire life, a family's savings, even a generation's idea of what progress looks like. Because somewhere right now, the next $50 billion story is already being written. The only question is whether you will be inside the hype or standing just outside it, watching with clear eyes when the music finally stops.